Welcome to Deep Focus. I'm John Kiriakou. The entire international community has been focused on the war in Palestine since it began way back on October 7th, 2023. While no civilized person supports terrorism or should support terrorism, including acts of wanton violence against civilians, Israel's response has been a mockery of international law and respect for human rights. Tens of thousands of Palestinians, maybe more than 100,000, have been killed since the start of the conflict, with 90% of them being civilians, and more than 100,000 people have been injured. There is not a single functioning hospital in Gaza, and the World Food Program says that half of all Palestinians face starvation on a scale not seen in decades. The refugee situation is unparalleled since the Second World War. And Donald Trump, in a meeting on February 4th with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, said that he wants the United States to take what he called an ownership position in Gaza. An ownership position. During the 2024 presidential campaign, Trump went so far as to say that all Gazans should be removed so that the land can be developed into beachfront real estate. Trump even suggested that Palestinians should be forcibly relocated to an island currently owned by Indonesia. Most Americans rely on truth tellers and journalists to tell us what is happening on the ground, especially during wartime. We simply can't trust the mainstream media. And God knows we can't trust our governments. We only learned, for example, the truth about Cambodia when John Pilger told us about it. We only learned what was really happening in Vietnam thanks to the likes of Dan Ellsberg and Cy Hirsch. And we're now learning the truths about Gaza thanks to our next guest. We are very happy to have my friend Chris Hedges with us today. Chris is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who was a foreign correspondent for 15 years with the New York Times, where he served as the Middle East bureau chief and Balkan bureau chief for the paper. He previously worked overseas for the Dallas Morning News, the Christian Science Monitor, and NPR. He's now host of the show, The Chris Hedges Report, and you can find his work on Substack and YouTube. Chris, thanks so much for joining us. It's always such a treat to have you.
Thanks, John.
Thank you. Chris, can you give us an overview, let's say set the stage for what Gaza is like today? We're a couple of weeks now into this so-called ceasefire, but there's no concrete plan to actually end the war or to help the Palestinian people in any substantive way. What exactly are we looking at?
Well, we're looking at the next step of the genocide, which is the entrapment of the Palestinians amid 50 million tons of rubble and debris, fetid pools of raw sewage. Of course, as you alluded to, the contamination and stench of thousands of corpses. I've heard numbers of dead perhaps as high as 200,000. And anecdotally, that fits with what I hear from friends and colleagues in Gaza. We some of whom got out, some of whom we know were killed, but many of whom just disappeared. So we haven't heard from them for weeks. And then friends of mine who did survive talk about whole families, extended families, being killed in airstrikes, but they're not listed, they're not registered as dead because the Hamas health ministry only provides lists from morgues and hospitals, which, again, as you said in the introduction, don't work. So you've essentially left Palestinians amid these shards of concrete. And then, of course, there's unexploded ordnance. There's all sorts of toxic substances, not just the raw sewage, but things like asbestos, hepatitis A that's caused by drinking contaminated water is already rampant, respiratory ailments, scabies, malnutrition, starvation, and then the nausea and vomiting that comes with food poisoning. And that's where they're going to be left to rot. 1.9 million people, the UN estimates, have been displaced. Many of them had to move several dozen times, or at least up to a dozen times. 9 in 10 homes have been destroyed. There's just nothing left. I mean, cemeteries, shops, offices, schools, hospitals, bakeries, mosques. They're gone. They're obliterated. The unemployment rate is 80%. The gross domestic product has been reduced by almost 85%. And then, of course, Israel has banned the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees in the Near East, which estimates that it'll take 15 years to clear the rubble if the rubble's cleared to rebuild Palestine, which it won't be, I don't think. And so that just ensures the Palestinians are going to live in this extreme humanitarian crisis, which both the Trump administration and the Netanyahu government will use, already has used, as an excuse for then wholesale displacement. That was Israel's plan all along. And just before I finish, we should acknowledge that Anthony Blinken, when he on his first trip to the Middle East, met with President Sisi in Egypt and King Abdullah in Jordan and other Arab leaders, and attempted ask them or attempted to impose quotas of Palestinians on them. Like, I don't remember what the numbers were exactly, but 1 million in the northern Egyptian Sinai, a few 100,000 in Jordan, et cetera, and they refused. So the difference in terms of the policies under the Biden administration and under the Trump administration are primarily rhetorical. They're not anything else.
As you may have seen, President Trump recently met at the White House with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And in those talks, Trump mentioned that the United States was interested in taking what he called an ownership position of the Gaza Strip.
Well, that has always been the goal since October 7th. That's always been Israel's intent. I think for those of us who spent 7 years covering the conflict, that's the open question. We know what they want to do. The question is, can they do it? I've been in Egypt twice this year, and Egypt and Jordan have been categorical in terms of their rejection of this ethnic cleansing, this transfer of population onto their territory. Of course, what Jordan is worried about is the transfer of the population from the West Bank, which shares a contiguous border with Jordan. Jordan's actually moved its military up to the border with Israel because it's worried about precisely this forced population transfer. Is it possible? That's the big open question. The Egyptian economy is in serious trouble. Its debt is $160 billion. We give Egypt about $1.3 billion in military aid. There are economic measures that the Trump administration could use to pressure Egypt. However, my understanding, by having been in Egypt, from other Egyptian journalists, is that the military high command has been unequivocal with President Sisi that it just won't happen. Mm-hmm. It won't happen because it will become a nightmare for the Egyptians. You will get cross-border raids. Mm-hmm. You will have armed factions. I mean, we saw it with the PLO in Lebanon. We saw it with the PLO in Jordan. I mean, we know what will happen, the kind of which the state will have a very difficult time controlling. Then you'll get Israeli strikes, and they just don't want to go that route. Plus, the fact that there's a great deal of anger, rage, even on the Arab street. And I know I've been was in Jordan most of the summer. I was in the West Bank. I've been in Qatar twice. There's real and these regimes, many of them, like the Jordanian regime, I would even argue the Saudi regime, are very fragile. And this would really push the population to a place they don't want it to go. Excuse me. The Sisi government, unlike the Jordanian government, has just outlawed all pro-Palestinian protests. They actually had a kind of government-orchestrated protest a few days ago up at Rafah. But they understand how easily those protests can spill over into anti-regime protests, which was happening in Amman when I was there this summer. They were not only was the crowd chanting "We are all Hamas," but they were chanting down the king, chanting down Abdullah.
Wow. And Jordan is a country that, well, for lack of a better phrase, has had a love-hate relationship with Palestinians over the years. 50% of the Jordanian population is Palestinian. They are the refugees of the initial war with Israel upon its creation, and their children, grandchildren, great grandchildren. The Egyptians have another love-hate relationship with the Palestinians. In fact, Itamar Ben-Gvir, who was a far-right Israeli minister until a couple of weeks ago, said just 4 or 5, 6 weeks ago that his solution was to expel all of the Gaza Palestinians into Sinai and to let them have Sinai. The Egyptians said that that would never happen. So if the Arab states don't want to take more Palestinians, and they shouldn't, if the Gulf Arab states don't want to get involved in a negotiation with either Israel or the United States and maybe come up with money to help rebuild Gaza, or the Israelis won't allow them, what is the alternative? It seems to me that there is no alternative. It should be Gaza for the Gazans, or I should say the West Bank and Gaza for the Palestinians. It should be up to all of us to help rebuild. And the Israelis, whether they like it or not, are going to have to come to some sort of a peace agreement. But that seems farther away now than it ever has been. Do you see any reason to be optimistic?
No,
No.
there is no Gaza anymore.
Right.
Virtually, it's destroyed. And the alternative would be leave or die.
Yeah.
Those are the two alternatives being offered to Palestinians in Gaza. And remember, as part of this phased peace deal, and Israel always, everything they sign is in phases. Camp
Yes.
David, Oslo, all the ceasefire agreements. And they get what they want in the first phase, in this case, the hostages, or at least some of them. And then they violate every other phase. They ignore them. And then they usually provoke the Palestinians. And the Palestinians respond, and they use that for another, they call it mowing the lawn, another campaign of aerial assaults and artillery assaults and ground incursions and everything else. So, no, that the alternative is clear and stark. It's leave or die, and so the aid shipments, which were heavy. I mean, a few hundred trucks. I think up to 600 a day. At the beginning of the ceasefire agreement, have now once again been choked off. And they're not going to let in building materials. Nothing's going to get rebuilt. So, yeah, they're going to create a hell on earth. There already is kind of a hell on earth. And they're going to wait the Palestinians out. They're going to wait the Egyptians out. They're going to wait the Jordanians out. But I think that is for all of us who have spent significant time in the Middle East, that is the open question. Where are they going to go? And I think it's too early at this point to answer that, because an infusion of 1 million Palestinians into Egypt would create social chaos. I mean, not just in Egypt, but throughout the region. The same is true with Jordan. So these are delicate entities, and many of these countries have very little real popular support. They're client states of the U.S. And yeah, they're really, this Israeli policy could dynamite the foundations of those countries in the Arab world that are allied with the United States. And I think we should acknowledge that the only country in the world to actively resist the genocide has been Yemen.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Actually, the Yemeni government issued a statement encouraging the Egyptians and the Jordanians to stand up to Israel, and saying that those countries would have the full-throated support of the Yemeni government were they to do so. When I lived in Saudi Arabia, I'm going to say 34 years ago now, there was a lot of talk at the time of the Saudis financing several major projects for Gaza. I'm talking about a port, an airport, an electrical grid, water treatment facilities that would serve to develop the economy. The Israelis said absolutely not 34 years ago. Is there any hope at all of developing Gaza in any way? You just said a moment ago that the Israelis are not going to allow building materials in. That then logically leads us to conclude that if we're not going to see building materials, we're not going to see major public works projects. Does that just mean Gaza is a permanently failed region?
Well, until the Palestinians are displaced, then the Jewish colonists will go in. They're already
Mhm.
drawing maps in northern Gaza. Jared Kushner has put significant investment funds in Israeli companies that want to develop northern Gaza. I don't know how much of a publicity stunt it is, but there have been synagogues throughout the United States
Yeah.
that have held auctions where Jewish members can come and buy plots of land in Gaza.
Yeah, they're calling them real estate seminars.
Right, 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 right. So, I mean, that shows you where they're headed, where they want to be headed. So, yeah, it's clear where they want to go. But I don't think, John, at this point, because of the ramifications throughout the region, and because of both the popular resistance to the massive population transfer and the fear on the part of Arab governments of what that transfer could do. We just don't know. That is something I think about a lot, but we just don't know. But that's clearly where the pressure is going. The Trump administration is behind it, but let's not give the Biden administration a pass, although they rhetorically honor the rule of law. They were not only complicit in sustaining and arming the Israelis during the genocide, over $20 billion worth of weapons and arms sales, but also behind the scenes. Blinken was working for Netanyahu.
I struggle to understand why neither of the major parties here in the United States seems to really care one whit about the Palestinians. And looking back at the 2024 election, I can't help but to conclude that Kamala Harris might have won Michigan, perhaps Pennsylvania, if she had expressed just an iota of support, at least for Palestinian human rights. Why have American politicians turned their backs on the Palestinians like this? We don't see this in European countries, for example, right? There's not a race among European political parties to see who's more pro-Israel than the other. Why do we have that here in the States?
Well, I would say that's not true in the UK, John. I mean, remember what happened to Jeremy Corbyn.
Yes.
So, but the UK is kind of our junior partner in this insanity. Well, money. I mean, they bought off the U.S. Congress.
Yeah, they have.
They bought it off. And Biden accepted more money from AIPAC than any other senator. I think it was $4.3 million or something. He still holds the record, even though he had been in the Senate for over a decade. So they buy them off. And the Palestinians don't have that lobbying arm. They don't have those financial resources. I think it also has an undercurrent of racism. The reason the alt-right, the Christian nationalists support Israel is because they look at that settler colonial project. European Jews, figures like Netanyahu, who was largely raised in the United States, went to MIT, grew up in Philadelphia. That's what they would like to flout international law and use lethal violence to get rid of people of color in our country. So I think that those two factors have made it extremely difficult for the Palestinians to get a fair hearing. And of course, the media has been horrendous in terms of the coverage. It's been an echo chamber for the far right of Israel. I mean, the Israeli press has actually been more courageous in terms of dissecting what happened on October 7th, imploding the lie that there was mass sexual assault. It's the Israeli journalists estimate that a few hundred Israelis were killed by Israel on October 7th because any vehicle headed back into Gaza, many of which, of course, had Israeli hostages, were blown up by Hellfire missiles or Apaches or something else. And then when they retook areas and they encountered houses and kibbutzes where fighters were holding Israelis, the tanks just blew them to pieces. They bombed their own eras, the checkpoint between Israel and Gaza, even though it had Israeli soldiers in it. This has all been in the Israeli press, but it's not been so much in the American press. I mean, the New York Times ran this unbelievably, uh, uh, baseless piece of journalism where they had actually hired an Israeli filmmaker who'd never done journalism and had worked in Israeli intelligence to fabricate this whole thing about rapes or sexual assault. I don't want to pretend that atrocities weren't committed. They were, of course, there's no question. Um, but all of the mechanisms of power in the United States kneel before the Israel lobby. And we've, of course, seen what's happened in the universities. These billionaire donors have shut down not just the encampments, but any whisper of dissent. They've turned all of these universities into academic gulags. And that's always, having worked as you did in despotic or authoritarian regimes, once the universities are shut down, that's a very ominous sign. Once there's no free speech within your universities, where free speech in any society should be sacrosanct, you're in big trouble. And so I live in Princeton, up the street, we have professors like Professor Ruha Benjamin, who's been great. She's teaching on probation. And students are facing suspension. Some have been suspended. Faculty have been pushed out. You just cannot. And this is a pretty clear-cut case, as you said at the beginning, of genocide. There's at this point very little dispute about it. It is the crime of crimes. It is a violation of both domestic and international or humanitarian law,
Okay.
and you're not allowed to speak about it.
No, you're not allowed to speak about it. Let's talk for a minute about Syria. We as Americans, we've been led to believe over the last 25, 30 years that we have no greater threat against us on a daily basis than what the Bush administration called Islamo-fascist terrorism. We can call it Al-Qaeda, we can call it ISIS, we can call it any number of different things. And now we seem to be in a partnership with Al Qaeda. Not only have we lifted a $10 million bounty that was placed on the head of the new leader of Syria, but the Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs, Barbara Leaf, and the State Department's head of hostage negotiations and a retinue of staff members went to Damascus to recognize this new regime. Now, in my mind, Al Qaeda is Al Qaeda is Al Qaeda. There's not a good Al Qaeda and a bad Al Qaeda. Now, Al Qaeda is running Syria, and the government of Bashar al-Assad, which, frankly, whether you like Bashar al-Assad's politics or not, was the only thing standing between minority communities and total annihilation. Now it's Al Qaeda running that government. Is this a long-term solution for Syria? Are we in bed with Al Qaeda now?
Well, again, it fits the Israeli project because, as you're well aware, Bashar al-Assad was allied with Iran and with Russia. You have Russian bases in Syria. The big thing was the arms shipments. So Hezbollah ran through Syria, and that was of higher priority. And if they had to, both the U.S. and Israel, I think it's pretty clear, along with Turkey, were funding the insurgents. And then the other issue are the oil fields. So the oil fields in northeastern Syria are controlled by the Syrian Kurds, which Turkey intends to wrest those oil fields from the Syrian Kurds because it has its Kurdish separatist problem in southeastern Turkey. So you have the oil, which was taken from. Part of the reason the Syrian economy collapsed was because the oil, they didn't have access to their oil, along with much of their agricultural area as well. So that's still in play, and the Turks are not going to rest until the Kurds are pushed out. The Kurds are backed by the United States, armed by the United States. There's, of course, a few thousand U.S. troops there. Israel has long, in kind of very quietly funded and armed Kurdish groups. So it's not over. And you're right. Syria is really a mix, like Lebanon, of all sorts of different ethnic groups, Christians, Alawites, kind of, uh, you know, all but Shia in name. The Alawites under the Assad regime ran Syria, ran the intelligence services, and the economy is not. I mean, in Damascus, they're getting electricity about an hour a day.
Yeah, it's
So
crazy.
yeah, but the priority was to strangle Hezbollah on behalf of Israel.
Yeah. And the Israelis now have taken up positions, not just along the border with Syria, but well inside the Syrian border. The first thing that came to my mind when I read these pieces in the New York Times, the Washington Post, was this is a further annexation. We're not talking about just the Golan Heights. The Israelis are inside Syrian territory.
Well, yes, this is the Greater Israel Project, which the extremists in Israel have pushed for a long time. I mean, they've drawn maps that include Israel's occupation, not just of Gaza and the West Bank, southern Lebanon, and the Golan Heights, but Jordan. And that's what we're seeing. Lebanon was destroyed by Israel, intentionally destroyed by Israel. You had, as you mentioned, efforts to rebuild, especially in Beirut. Hariri, the old prime minister, who in his own right, I think was a billionaire, but certainly very wealthy, oversaw these investment projects. Well, those were the first things that Israeli warplanes would strike every time they hit Lebanon, including the airport and everything else. So what they've done to Lebanon, and remember what they did to Syria immediately after the fall of Bashar al-Assad, the Israeli Air Force decimated the military infrastructure of Syria. And Syria, like Lebanon, these are states that are on the cusp of what we would call failed states. The infrastructures are broken and decimated, haven't been repaired. Again, long uh, electrical outages in Lebanon. The economy's a wreck, just as it is in Syria. And that's the way it will remain. So, what Israel did to Gaza, what Israel did to Lebanon, what Israel did to Syria, it's going to keep doing, so that, with the exception of Egypt, all of the countries on its border are hanging on by their fingertips. Their populations are living at subsistence levels.
Chris, when I was serving in Kuwait at the end of the Gulf War back in 1991, there was this universal feeling among Kuwaitis, especially members of the Kuwaiti royal family and senior Kuwaiti government officials, that in 6 months, 12 months, whatever it was, there would be no Palestinians left in Kuwait. They wanted to expel every one of them because the Palestinian leadership of Yasser Arafat had supported Saddam Hussein during the Gulf War. You got the same feeling in Saudi Arabia, the same feeling in the United Arab Emirates. Has that changed over 34 years, or is there still this resentment against Palestinians in the wealthy Gulf countries, with the exception of Qatar? Is this a problem for the Palestinians, or has it passed?
I think it's passed. However, I was also in Kuwait in '91, of course. And a lot of Palestinians were expelled. I mean, a significant number. Of course, there were
Oh,
mob
yes.
attacks against Palestinians, kind of ugly. I think it's passed. I think, especially after October 7th, the savagery, which has been live streamed, this live stream genocide has really provoked deep anger at Israel, deep anger at the Arab regimes that collaborate with the U.S. and Israel, because U.S. is correctly seen as not just complicit, but part of this genocidal project, a full partner in this genocidal project. And on the Arab street, uh, there's a feeling that these regimes are not only part of the oppression of the Palestinians, but they feel oppressed themselves. So there's a kind of solidarity. If you're living in a Arab dictatorship, you feel a kind of solidarity with the Palestinians. So my experience since October 7th, with repeated trips to the Middle East and significant time in the West Bank and in Jordan, is that that animosity, which you're correct to raise, is gone, and that people are just appalled and outraged at what's happening and the failure on the part of Arab nations and the international community to intervene to stop it. That's pretty widespread. Just anecdotally, if you go to the West Bank and you go into people's homes, you're more often than not going to see a picture of Saddam Hussein, not
That's
Yasser
exactly
Arafat.
right. That
to
is
this
exactly right. Chris Hedges, esteemed journalist, truth teller, thanks for joining us today. This was a real education, and I wish you the best. And I want to reiterate, you can find Chris's work on his Substack, Chris Hedges, and also on YouTube. Anywhere else you'd like to point people?
No, chrishedges.substack.com. You'll get everything there. And then the YouTube stuff
Great.
goes on there too.
Thanks for joining us, Chris. All the best.
Thank you.